privilege of being asked to speak to the Historical Society here in Adelaide. I'm very much aware that I'm from what the locals seem to call interstate, and indeed a number of people keep on expressing surprise that I could even come here and learn anything at all about South Australian history. They little realise how intriguing a history South Australia has, and perhaps no part more intriguing than the history of the various churches in this area. Robert said that it's an intriguing title. First of all, it's about a man, John Henry Norton, and the reason for that is that my interest in and approach to the history of any place or any period has always been largely biographical. I'm interested in the people who make the most of a particular environment and who help to build the story of a community by living there. So this talk is about a man, John Henry Norton, 3rd Bishop of the Northern Catholic Diocese of this state. He was the first parish priest of Peterborough, and we see him against the development of an area that is already treated in books like William's Making of the South Australian Landscape, which is an encyclopedia and a constant reference for anyone like myself who needs to learn about that. Anita Wood's Petersburg to Peterborough, and Meinig's On the Margins of the Good Earth. I think those books give a fairly good account of the development of the northern area, and it's always good to keep that in mind when we're thinking of this particular subject of the Port Augusta Diocese and the people who live there. I gave him the subtitle Bishop of Railways, although he was officially known as the Bishop of the Diocese of Port Augusta, which has been called Port Pirie since 1951. The reason will become clearer as I go on, I think. The site of the first church in Peterborough is quite symbolic of this reason. If one goes past the train or goes along the road to St Anacletus Church there is a triangle of land between the railway line and the road. And on that triangle of land stood the first Catholic church, which had been a Methodist church. It was bought from the Methodists. Now, Methodism and the railways had an important part to play in John Henry Norton's life, and so I always think that that was quite a symbolic site for that particular church. A few words about the Northern Diocese first of all. When Patrick Moran, who was soon to be created the Cardinal Archbishop of Sydney, as a consolation prize, I might add, for not being Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin. When Moran came to Australia in 1884, he set about tidying up the administrative structure which would create an Australian church, not merely a collection of colonial dioceses. Moran, in doing that, was some years ahead of federation, in which he was also interested. It was a large task in a country that was still regarded in the Northern Hemisphere as a missionary country, with each colony having a different origin and the traditions already settling into place. Moran convened a council of all the bishops, although there weren't so many, and their advisors, to come to Sydney in the next year after his arrival, 1885. And one of the results of that council was to divide the huge territory of South Australian jurisdiction into 2 dioceses, not because the population warranted it, but because of the size of the area and the vast distances between several areas. I'll just show you the map there, which may make things a little clearer as I go along. It's an old map, so I apologise for it. But somebody has put little dotted lines all over it to show where the dioceses, where their boundaries were, I think about the turn of the century. In South Australia, it had become clear that more than one administrator was needed to clear away the mountain of church debts which had accumulated after 40 years of financial mismanagement. That's all well recorded in our earlier history. So the first appointment to the north was of a very financially able man from Perth, a bearded, very unusual man, John O'Reilly. The boundaries of the new diocese, and there I can point them out to you, were set to the west at the West Australian border, to the east the borders of Queensland, New South Wales and just touching on Victoria, to the south the Murray River across to the Gulf just south of Crystal Brook. Those of you with keen or telescopic eyesight will see that the person who drew the dotted line there left Porphyry and Crystal Brook out of the Northern Diocese, but I assure you they belong to it. Oddly enough, the northern limit, perhaps due to a lapsus pennae by some Vatican clerk, is still the 25th parallel, not the 26th, which is the state border, and so you have a line above the state border there. The area was about 400,000 square miles, with a Catholic population of approximately 9,000, which I think would be something less than one person to 40 square miles. And a debt of £17,000, which was a considerable amount in those days when you could buy a house for, and he did buy one for £400. The amount was calculated by the size of the debt in Adelaide, which had a debt of £55,000, and so they kind of divided it into thirds and gave 1/3 of it to the Northern Diocese, to nobody's particular pleasure. In this area, the validity of Goyder's line was still being tested by the farmers, who pushed the wheat farming as far north as they could, before a succession of dry years taught them a bitter and practical lesson and sent many families to Ayers Peninsula and the west coast in search of better conditions. Little did they know. As Williams writes, however, it was the railways, rather than the individual pioneers, who provided the spearhead for the expansion of settlement and consolidation. In 1875, the government policy was to leave no farming district further than 15 miles from a railway, the Murray River or the coast. Sidings for loading produce were to be set along lines at 5 miles intervals, the lines then leading to the ports. This explains the extraordinary pattern of narrow gauge lines which already existed when John Norton arrived in Peterborough. This is one of Williams's maps. And in his usual way, he hasn't identified any towns except, thank heaven, Peterborough and Tarawi. They were in contention for being the main junction when the line was built out to New South Wales. When he arrived in Peterborough, narrow gauge lines linked Peterborough and Tarawi with Port Augusta via a line which wandered north through Carrington and Quorn. You can see it take a curl up there. The line to Porphyry went through Jamestown. Back to Adelaide went via Burra, or Coringa, and to Kadina and Wallaroo via Port Wakefield. He didn't use that one very much. Peterborough was, therefore, already an active railhead and a junction town when, in 1884, its first resident priest came to take care of the 300 Catholics who had until then been included in the Peterborough parish. They were mostly small farmers. There were only 300 of them, and the support of the priest was supposed to come from that area. They were mostly small farmers, farm workers, railwaymen, with a sprinkling of shopkeepers, mostly of Irish or Polish origin. Very few were well-to-do or influential. Hotel keeper, the Stairs, were one family. And another exception was the district railway superintendent, James Maguire, who was lately the Commissioner for Railways in South Australia and the father of quite famous Paul Maguire. At the end of John Norton's first year in Peterborough, it was announced that Peterborough, not Tarawi, was to be the junction for the line to be built connecting the existing railways with the New South Wales border, a line variously referred to as the Silverton, Broken Hill or Coburn line. Locals felt that their town's future was now assured. The new pastor was 28 years old, only 2 years away from his ordination in Rome, and Peterborough was to become his home for the next 39 years, until his death there in 1923. He was not your typical missionary priest for those times or for those regions. For one thing, he was Australian born and very proud to say so. He was not Irish. His father was a Londoner. The manager, variously termed mine manager, legal manager, general manager, of a mine at Magpie outside Ballarat for the Sir William Don Company, quite well known in those days. They lived, apparently, in Ballarat itself, however. His mother was from Waterford, perhaps Catholic by baptism, but now practising the Methodist religion of her husband. John Norton was born on New Year's Eve 1855 and was raised as a Methodist, attending the Pleasant Street Church, which is still there and still operating as a uniting church. I noticed last year. He used to attend with his family and went to the Sunday school, becoming one of the prize Sunday school pupils. It was interesting that when he was Bishop of Port Augusta some years later, round about the first time of the First World War, they had their Jubilee celebration at Pleasant Street, and they wrote and invited him back to the celebrations as one of their prize pupils. He was very touched by that invitation, unusual enough in those days, I think, from a Methodist congregation to a Catholic bishop. In Ballarat he went to dame schools and a grammar school, most of these small private schools in those days, and then he attended what he called a commercial college. I'm getting all of this from the details he wrote about his own life when submitting a report to Rome on one occasion, and also, thank heavens, he kept a diary from the time he was 17 until he died, and mercifully these have been spared the cleaning up activities of anybody at Peterborough so far. He went to this commercial college, and we've never been able to track down exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the Ballarat School of Mines and Design. The mines had been going for quite a while, the design part of it was quite new. But during that time he appears to have been apprenticed as an architectural draftsman. During this period, at the age of 14, and he didn't ever give a reason for it, he was received into the Catholic Church, and 2 years later he was encouraged to enrol at St Patrick's College, East Melbourne, to study first for matriculation, then to pursue philosophical and theological studies in preparation for ordination as a priest. At that time, St Patrick's was under the care of the Jesuit fathers, and Norton studied there with their students, and it also seems part-time at Melbourne University. Some 3 years into this course of studies, the Bishop of Adelaide, who was then Christopher Reynolds, the author of a lot of that death that I was speaking of, visited Melbourne, and he proposed that Norton transfer to the Adelaide Diocese, thereby showing more perception than the Archbishop of Melbourne, who had already decided that so recent a convert without any Catholic family tradition was a risky proposition for the Archdiocese of Melbourne. Norton was sent to study in Rome, having first to spend a year at St Kieran's, Kilkenny, in Ireland, while waiting for a vacancy at the Missionary College of Propaganda Fide in Rome. In both Ireland and Rome, he was able to continue his musical studies in piano, organ and singing. He had a fine voice, as well as continuing his ministerial studies, and he was ordained priest in St John Lateran's in 1882. He took an utter delight in those years in Rome, and one of the things he wrote in his diary was that at the Jesu, which is the church which is kept by the Jesuit fathers, he used to hear the choirs of children, and he was so enchanted with the Roman children's choir that he made up his mind that when he got back to Australia he was going to train children to sing in church. His musical talent also set him apart from many of his colleagues, even on the way across to London. His diaries record playing the piano and singing in the ship's saloon on the voyage. It was a clipper, and he made the most of that journey. Sometimes it was boring. When they were becalmed at one stage, he records walking about the deck and then climbing up into the rigging to see what it was like. He was pursued by a sailor who tied him up and wouldn't let him go until he promised to buy him a bottle of whiskey. He was not without an adventurous spirit, you'll think. Later, his voice was much in demand, of course, when he came back to South Australia. He used to take part in the ceremonies which required someone who could sing. He joined in Philharmonic choirs in Adelaide, although he was only here for 1 year, and in Peterborough. His name appears on lots of programs of concerts and performances up there, either as a conductor or as an accompanist. And true to his wish, he trained children's choirs in both Adelaide and Peterborough. His social graces were obviously well developed, which also made him slightly apart from your average country pastor. He enjoyed company and mixed well. He had a reputation among some of the priests for being hot-headed and hot-tempered. This may have arisen from a tendency that he had to take huff and respond very huffily when his accounting methods were questioned. And when members of his own congregation came to him and asked to see the account books, there was an enormous row, and he took the greatest of umbrage to that. He was not a tall man, and sometimes a little man has his own vanities like that. He arrived on the afternoon train from Adelaide in a blinding dust storm in January 1884. Full of energy and enthusiasm, despite the lack of house, church, or local knowledge, he knew hardly anyone. His diaries and the books in which he recorded the parish involvement during the next 39 years ranged through the usual activities such as supervising the building of churches. He drew up plans and specifications for a number of them. I found this quite astonishing when I first read it in the diaries, and I thought, oh well, he perhaps drew rough plans and got someone to finish. But no, the diaries go on with an account of days spent over getting his plans exact, drawing up the specifications no less, and calling the tenders. And it does seem quite astonishing that a boy of 13 with an apprenticeship until he was 17 would have had enough practice and gained enough skills to be able to do this design. But there it was. He drew up the plans and specifications for a number of churches, not just for one, including a wooden one at the Chitalpa goldfield, which blew down in a freak gale, much to his mortification. But also the large stone church of St. Anacletus, which is still in use in Peterborough and has stood the test of years very well. Also he designed the churches at Lancelot and Dawson. Much of his time was devoted to travelling from house to house, settlement to settlement, by any and all of the means of transport available, including the brake van of many a train. Not a skilled horseman, he bought a horse and buggy as soon as he got to Peterborough because someone told him that he'd need one. But he went through the usual new chum experiences with a horse which refused to be caught on Sunday mornings, and sometimes also refused to budge in any way except to be led by an exasperated Norton for 6 miles to the waiting church congregation. He visited everyone, Catholic or not, and from the beginning called on the generosity of parishioners to help pay for the 4-room house and furniture he bought from a Protestant widow for £450, and for the church building he also bought from the Wesleyans for £100. This building, the one I spoke of that stood there near the railway line, was destined to be used as a school during the week and as a church on Sundays. Outside Peterborough, worshipping communities wanted churches of their own. Mass celebrated in a hotel parlour, butcher shop, local hall, small tent or a bush hut was not their idea of a dignified way to worship. And so the small buildings went up at Lancelot, Dawson, Chitalpa, Yongala, which he also bought from the Methodists. And I think it's an interesting thing to note that in both Peterborough and Yongala, the Methodist congregation from whom he bought the church sent a great number of their members to attend the opening ceremonies of the Catholic, their building as a Catholic church. Again, this was the 1880s and not what you'd call the height of the ecumenical movement. It says something about his Methodist background, I think, that enabled him to move easily. In 1 week, in June 1886, for instance, he recorded a journey which was to be repeated several times, and this may give you a clue as to why I chose that subtitle. He travelled along the line under construction between Peterborough and Silverton, visiting 2 villages and 6 construction camps between Peterborough and Manor Hill, which was as far as the line had been constructed. Each stopping place is identified only by the name of the gang foreman. It hadn't been given any other name at that stage. He slept each night in a different location, graphically describing later the gathering in someone's tent for mass and prayers before dawn. And mind you, this was winter time, when the men set off for work. He rode with the gangers on a tricycle to the next camp and returned from the end of the work in the same way. The experience for him was so richly rewarding that he repeated it when the next section was begun from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie. By that time, it was as my Lord Bishop that he made the journey, but in similar circumstances, perhaps an even dustier trip. He told a Peterborough congregation in 1888, "During 1886, the greater part of my time was spent, when I could possibly get away, in visits along the Silverton line, holding mass stations among the men on the railway from camp to camp, and visiting also the sheep stations. Didn't waste any time. Many a boiling day and many a cold night did I experience. Many a wetting I received, and many a night I camped with the generous-hearted and truly noble men in their tents, sleeping on a few bags or on a little chaff, rising before daybreak. Never was I happier or more contented in my whole life. I shall never forget the days and nights spent among those dear good men along the line." When he had to go to Port Augusta or to Adelaide, where he may have had to attend meetings or take the cantor's role in the cathedral Easter ceremonies, because Archbishop O'Reilly was no singer, as well as being rather delicate at that stage, he used the railways. And here his diaries reveal another function of the rail journey for him. Not only did it provide a living for his parishioners, but it formed a link in the lives and relationships of the clergy of the North, as well as for those who were travelling through from New South Wales to Adelaide, or vice versa, or anywhere else for that matter. Priests visited each other. The little house in Peterborough was forever being hospitable to a traveller, or the priest from Jamestown, Pekin, or other parish. No wonder the first housekeeper in Peterborough alarmed them all with screaming hysterics, which went on for a week on one occasion. The calls on her skills were pretty constant. When a function in Adelaide required their presence, the priests travelled together on the train, gathering up others en route. One can only imagine the deals that were made, the opinions exchanged, and the support that was sought in those carriages as the train lumbered on at a steady 35 miles an hour. He didn't ever mention that they played cards, which was unlike his successor, Bishop Killian, who had a passion for bridge. And on one occasion, when Bishop Killian had attended a ceremony in Goulburn, New South Wales. He was returning to Melbourne by the express with 3 other bishops, and they played bridge all the way from Goulburn to Melbourne, and he concluded the entry in his diary, rather regretfully, that he lost 30 shillings. Norton's days became even busier when O'Reilly became Archbishop of Adelaide in 1895. He was still the parish priest of Peterborough, and James Marr, the parish priest of Peterborough, became the 2nd Bishop of Port Augusta. He was a strange man. He must have been very able, but once he became bishop he seemed to stand stock still. He refused to live anywhere but Peterborough because he knew the people and it was his home, fair enough. He had been parish priest there for many years. He relied on John Norton to work out diocesan finance. He signed the cheques, but he left Norton to carry out all the practical details. Norton was called on to give advice about which priest should serve where, and then write the letters of transfer, as well as all official letters to Cardinal Moran, whom Marr claimed to be quite afraid of. He also had to write to Vatican officials and the missionary bodies, on whom they depended for a great number of donations. No wonder John Norton slipped into place as the 3rd bishop when Marr died in 1905. As bishop, he continued to make Peterborough his home, but he immediately set about visiting every other part of the diocese. He combined this visitation with the task of acquainting everyone all over the north with their duty to help finance the building of the Port Augusta Cathedral, as well as to help liquidate the debts at Coringa. These were the 2 oversized diocesan debts still remaining. With less than 1,000 Catholics, he felt that if people could only contribute a couple of pounds each, average, that they would soon liquidate these debts, but it was strange how few people wanted to contribute for anything outside their own region, and he became quite a persuasive speaker. He would go to a parish, he would speak to the people, mix with them, be as pleasant as he possibly could, and usually he came away with a sizable donation. If he didn't, he went back again. He managed to combine his pastoral duties of visiting a locality to confer the sacrament of confirmation, of getting to know the far-flung faithful of the diocese, and making an appeal for money without entirely losing his popularity. In 1908 he went as far as Augusta, a trip which involved 3 days' travel in what he described as a special cattle train. Then, being escorted from the railhead by a party of horsemen, 16 horses, 2 buggies, 2 Aboriginal stockmen and a mule, to the various outposts. His friends, the Stairs from Peterborough, by this time were living up there, and he was very relieved to find someone he knew. After experiencing some distance riding on a camel, he and his companion Father Kirby seemed to have no difficulty in refusing an invitation to continue the journey further north to the diocesan boundary in the Northern Territory. When he went to Eyre Peninsula, he started from Franklin Harbour or Port Lincoln on several occasions, journeying as far as Eucla by whatever means was available. After 1912, Patrick L. Kelly, ex-surveyor, and Peter Jorgensen, both of them legendary figures on the west coast, were the proud owners of one of the first motor cars on the peninsula, and subsequent journeys were made in a cloud of dust and comparative comfort and speed. He also travelled by train in those regions when the branch lines were built, and he described one trip going south from Minnepa, or somewhere along there. He described a trip which was quite horrifying because as they went they were ringed by spectacular bushfires. Not that he concentrated on church affairs to the exclusion of all else. It was written of him later that he had always been a good townsman, and his signature is to be found among those who petitioned for a town council sometime in the 1880s. Some of his Ballarat experience seems to have been evoked by the discovery in Brady's Valley by Mr. Terence Brady of enough gold to set off a modest gold rush. The company which Brady and others formed, the Niagara Copper Company, strangely called, had J.H. Norton as its listed secretary. His role was apparently both advisory and honorary, since no appreciable increase appeared in his bank balance. There isn't any doubt, I think, that he had hoped that this may be one solution to the ultimate wiping off of the diocesan debt, but that was not to be. He was very interested in that Chitalpa field, and he visited it whenever he could. The day the church blew down, he went off in a great hurry, went by train as far as he could go, borrowed a horse and buggy, and because the cause of the blowing down of the church had been a gale and almost a cyclone with torrential rains, he hadn't taken it into account that the creeks would be coming down in torrents. And so, going along at a spanking pace, he drove into one creek and found himself carried down the creek, the horse struggling, and he just managed to get to the bank to see the horse and buggy carried off downstream, much to his dismay. Fortunately, someone came riding along just at that stage, and they rescued him, and they went off and discovered that the horse and the buggy could be recovered, neither of them having suffered a great deal of damage, but it did teach him to be careful when he came to flooded creeks. Not all that common in experience, I should imagine, if you live in Peterborough. None of the Norton story is the stuff of heroic tradition, any more than are the stories of hundreds of his parishioners in the north. As Archbishop O'Reilly's health got worse, Norton was called on to act as an unofficial coadjutor or helper bishop, especially in the furthest parts of the state to which O'Reilly could not travel, and that went on until the appointment of Robert Spence in 1913 as the coadjutor Archbishop of Adelaide. After that, Norton's activities were directed to extending the church, having built a larger bishop's house to accommodate the staff and many visitors. It's quite an imposing building if you've seen it at Peterborough, and it's rather amusing to see that he had that sense of dignity of a bishop's position. He referred to the fact that the bishop's elevated office needed a better accommodation than the four-roomed house in which he had lived all those years. It's also interesting to see that he got quite a number of his ideas after having visited Sydney for the synod and being shown over the beautiful new Cardinal's Palace at Manly. He got quite a few ideas, I think, about building for the bishop's elevated office from that visit. He didn't design that house, he got an architect to do it. He always had a hard job securing enough priests to staff the diocese. Sometimes the young Irish priests resented the amount of control that he exercised. He was fairly authoritarian, and he had a few rows, and a few of them departed for fresh fields in America and other places. His letters to Irish seminaries told of the beautiful climate of the north, which they found out for themselves when they got here, as well as the scope for missionary zeal. He travelled, as I said, to Sydney to represent the South Australian clergy, and also to Perth on Archbishop O'Reilly's behalf. But he never made the usual visit to Rome again in order to report on the diocese, no doubt for financial reasons. That would have been a great disappointment to him, because he dearly loved the Roman churches, the Roman city itself. He died in 1923, aged only 68. It's interesting to see his grave in the Peterborough cemetery. There is a plain cross with a concrete coping around the plot, and they were put there 12 years after his death, when money was available. Bishop Killian didn't think that that was one of the priorities. And when you see this plain cross and plain grave, flat on the ground like everybody else's, with red dust and just one tree in the background, it's very symbolic of his simple approach to life and duty. His talents, which included meticulous accounting, as well as musical and gardening ability, not to mention his architectural experience, gave him some special flair for his task, which could well have been carried out in places bigger than Peterborough and the north. But when one thinks of it, Peterborough and the north were not like Victoria, where he had grown up. Yet he was able to adapt to an unfamiliar environment with great energy, enthusiasm, and an undoubted spirit of adventure and good humour, at least for most of the time. This tubby, genial little man brought warmth and humanity to his administrative and pastoral role, which makes his story worth recording among those who have officiated in the north, on and off the beaten track. I'm not an architectural expert, or even ecclesiastical architectural expert. It's an extremely simple and functional church, and wouldn't have demanded a great deal of intricate knowledge. They have very simple Gothic windows, and that was about the only ornamentation that he allowed himself, especially in the original building. I think he was wise enough to confine himself to what he could manage. And it is also quite likely that he would have had reference, some kind of reference, because I couldn't imagine him simply. My information, you might understand, comes from his own diaries, and beyond that I haven't, there's not much you can locate.
I'm wondering if you're able to offer any hints from your own observations, about why he made it, or are there any clues from outside sources? Obviously, you didn't apparently mention it in his diaries.
Right. He began the diaries when he was 17, so that was when he went to Melbourne to study, and all of this was behind him. And he didn't give a lot of clues even to his family life. He had a funny family. His mother must have died just at that time, just when he was going to Melbourne, because the father had the younger members of the family in Melbourne with him. And one of the reasons why he was, the people were querying whether he'd be a bishop, in fact, this is off the track a little bit, he had one brother who was forever getting into trouble with the police, and he got a job on the railways and greatly embarrassed Father Norton by being sent down to Adelaide and charged with pilfering, which is a common enough railway crime, I think. But as I said, it was extremely embarrassing to him, and he came down to Adelaide to see if he could rescue him from that. Likewise, one of his sisters, Bishop O'Reilly, said that he was reporting on him to somebody, and he said, his family is not quite what one would desire. He has one sister who's a barmaid, and I don't know what kind of blot on the family escutcheon that was. But none of the other members of the family ever became Catholic. And my guess was that his mother may well have been a Catholic and just let that slide. And some priest in Ballarat obviously took an interest in him and encouraged him, and that may be the second thing that led him there. He certainly hadn't been to had any kind of Catholic schooling until he was studying in Melbourne at 17 years of age.
As he wrote in his diary for so long, does he actually have a set circuit for each year? Sort of each year you think, right, I'll have to go around South Australia this way and take into consideration that these lands have been taken up, I'll have to go and visit this station.
That's right.
Does that actually, his workload increase as he gets older, or less?
It got less because in the beginning, when he started, he was only the pastor of Peterborough, so that anywhere that was dependent on Peterborough, he visited. And that was a considerable distance. As I said, it was right along the line towards New South Wales, and the part which has been in later years in the Catholic diocese up there called the Outback Mission, which is a kind of a winding up and down right up to the Birdsville track actually. I don't think he ever got as far as that. But he went from one station to the other. They'd drive him in the buggy. Does that answer?
Yes.
And then, as he, when Archbishop O'Reilly, when he didn't have to do his work for him anymore in the country parts of the Adelaide Archdiocese, that was when he made his longer trips out along the west coast, right along as far as Eucla. They're fascinating stories. He used to go anywhere that people wanted him to go. So there was somebody to be confirmed way down past Streaky Bay somewhere, and he went down there, and there was an old lady who hadn't been to Mass for years because she was too old and there was no one to take her. And she had two friends who lived nearby. But she was the only Catholic for miles and miles and miles. But he stopped there and said Mass for her, and the two friends came along to make up a congregation of three. And his diary is full of those small anecdotes. He didn't have to wait for a large congregation. He just went wherever people were. And I think that's not exceptional. It was the pastoral way of people who worked out in those places then. No, there's a new church there now. Yes.
Vegetation for being or anything like that?
No, he doesn't seem to have. Well, again, he hasn't recorded it. Let me put it that way. I think his time was very occupied, and I don't think he took a lot of part in that kind of social agitation. But he was interested, and as I said, they recognised him as being very interested in public affairs, and he was on platforms for various things.
Yeah. Was he ever given any other recognition, such as domestic prelate or things like that?
No, nobody ever called him Monsignor. No. He just got to be a bishop, and it's rather interesting, to see the kind of, it's a paradox or a conflict, if you like, of role. When you see the circumstances, very poor people, very plain, ordinary circumstances, hard work, dusty, dirty, no mod cons, but he was a bishop, and so he had some purple gear, and he had an idea that this was a dignified, a role of some dignity in the church, and somehow he had to match that with, as I said, the dirt and the dust and the cattle trains. It's a fascinating kind of a connection that people have to make in those circumstances, I think. Be the same with missionary bishops.
Covering South Australia so widely at that time, has he got any interesting comments on Aborigines?
No, it's a rather interesting thing. The only time he seems to have encountered Aborigines was on that trip to Oodnadatta, and as far north as they went there. And it's a very interesting fact that in later years, one of the bishops, and I think it was as late as Bishop McCabe, who went there in the 40s after Cardinal Gilroy had been there briefly, but he received a direct question from Rome, asking about, they were very direct questions, how many Aboriginals were there in his territory and how many Catholics were there. And he said, to the best of his knowledge, there were no Catholic Aborigines, and also to the best of his knowledge, there were only 2 families in the whole of the area that he visited. And that was Bishop McCabe. And the reason for that, I think, would have been that the mission stations had already been set up, and the Lutheran mission stations and so on, so that the Catholic, St. Teresa mission wasn't for years and years later, and that was up in the Northern Territory. But in this state, and I haven't gone into this in great detail yet, but I haven't yet come across any evidence of a very strong effort on the part of the Catholic Church in the Northern Diocese or the Adelaide Diocese until recent years to make any kind of overtures and advance and take some direct care.
As usual, I'll ask our Vice President, Brian, which will say a few words of thanks.
Sister Margaret's talk conjured up a couple of lines of thought for me. One is we've had a great many local histories produced in South Australia, but very few regional histories. Something Ron Gibbs, our founding president, likes to make that point from time to time, that by taking a regional focus, it lets you look at a lot of different topics and different areas, and there's still a great need for more regional studies of the state. And the second one derives more directly from the title of the talk, which is, of course, the railways, and visions of the priests gathering their number on the way down and playing cards or whatever. There's an enormous number of books on railways, often on the details of the locomotives and whatever, and not so much on the social life on board. I can't think of very many at all that deal with that, and there's a whole area there that bears some exploration along a lot of the modes of transport, the ships, federation meetings being held with politicians travelling by sea. That just provoked a whole line of interesting thoughts for me. So I'd ask you again to show your thanks for tonight's talk.